The Liberal Democratic Party surges back to power in Japan just 3 years after a humiliating defeat. The victory comes at a time when Japan's relations with neighboring China are deteriorating. So what does it all mean for the volatile region? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Dareen Abughaida. Japan's Liberal Democrats have won a landslide victory in elections, and their leader, Shinzo Abe, is widely expected to become the country's next prime minister. It'll be his second shot at the top job. He briefly served as prime minister between 2006 and 2007. And Abe says he wants Japan to have a more assertive role internationally and has already warned neighboring China over territorial disputes in the East China Sea.
The Senkaku Islands are Japan's inherent territory. Japan owns and controls the islands under international law. There is no room for negotiation on this point.
Well, let's just take a look at where Japan's new government is likely to take the country. As we heard, Abe has taken a tough stand on Japan's territorial dispute with China. His party says it would build a permanent facility on the islands, which is likely to further increase the tension between those two countries. Abe has also called for a revision of Japan's pacifist constitution, and he believes the country should have a more assertive regional as well as international presence. He's also expected to reverse the previous government's decision to abandon nuclear power after the Fukushima disaster last year. And in an effort to boost growth, Abe has promised more public spending and wants to ease monetary policy. So are fears of the LDP coming back to power in Japan exaggerated? To help answer this question and more, we're joined by our guests in Tokyo, Okubo Takuji. He's the chief economist at Japan Macro Advisors. In Hong Kong, Andrew Leung, an independent China analyst. And over in Oxford, Professor Arthur Stockwin. He's a fellow and former director at the Nissan Institute for Japanese Studies at the University of Oxford. It's good to have you with us on Inside Story. Takuji, we'll dissect the issues that Abe will be dealing with in just a moment, but let's just take a look at the election. Was the LDP party chosen because voters truly support it, or were people just voting against the ruling Democratic Party?
I do think the direct answer to your question is the latter. So I don't think it was so much LDP won, but it was more DPJ, the current ruling party, lost heavily.
Professor Stockwin, Abe's first administration in 2006 was marred by scandals as well as accusations that he stalked his cabinet with his close friends. Are you surprised by the win of the LDP?
I'm not particularly surprised because the Democratic Party government of Mr. Noda had failed to live up to its promises and had made a number of mistakes, even though, of course, you have to remember that they had to face the terrible disasters in northern Japan March of last year. But I think that the thing about this election is it is a very substantial lurch to the right in Japanese politics. And I think that Mr. Abe is not a very impressive politician in terms of his past record, and I suspect that much of the electorate, in fact, was voting for the LDP as a sort of default position. It was a sort of comfortable position to be in because they had ruled the country for so many years before they were kicked out in 2009.
Right. Andrew, your thoughts now. Do you credit the resurgence of the LDP to Abe himself, or is this just a backlash against the ruling Democratic Party?
Well, I think that there's, as my colleague was saying, there's a rise in right-wing politics in Japan. And in fact, the Japanese electorate is getting a little bit tired of decades of Japanese decline. First of all, the Japanese economy was overtaken by China. And also, Japan is seeing its international space as being increasingly being reduced because of the rise of China. And of course, a lot of the people in Japan that were born after the Second World War, and they do not understand why Japan should continue to have the tail behind its back, as it were. So I think that there is a resurgence of Japanese nationalism and a resurgence of Japanese a kind of international profile. So that leads to the win of the party, the Liberal Democratic Party.
We'll certainly talk about the nationalism in just a moment, but Takuji, I was looking at some early voting numbers which showed that voting was in fact down more than 10% than in previous elections. So what does this tell us really about the mindset of the Japanese voters, and what's your take on the reason for the lower voting numbers?
Right. So I do think what happened this time was that the voters were frustrated with the current ruling party's DPJ. However, they actually saw little alternative. So they don't like DPJ to continue being in power, but I don't think many of them actually were enthusiastic about the LDP, nor other parties. So that's why the participation rate of votes were lower this time.
And I'll just stay with you for just a moment. For voters in this election, how much of an election issue was the dispute with China over these islands in the East China Sea that we are referring to, that both countries are claiming as their own? How important is that for the Japanese voter?
Right. I wouldn't say it was actually important. A top issue, there was a lot of survey on this, but the top issue on voters' mind was more on the economy side. The economic cycles, unemployment rate, job market. These were the top issues voters voted out DPJ and welcomed LDP. So I actually do not think it was this nationalistic tendency of soon-to-be Prime Minister Abe that LDP won. It was more of an economic policy of his.
Right, and we'll certainly be talking about the economic policy just a little later. But Professor Stockwin, how much teeth do you think the Shinzo Abe will have to take this issue head on, this dispute with China over the islands?
Well, I think one thing to be said here is that to some extent the Chinese government, in my view, is somewhat responsible for the terrific shift to the right in Japanese politics, because they've been extremely belligerent over this island question, and I think people have developed in Japan quite a concern and a fear even of China, and I think this is one, though by no means the only reason why the electorate should have supported so heavily the LDP. But I think Mr. Abe, to touch on your question, does not have huge scope for action for one very good reason, and that is that there is a fundamental structural problem in Japanese politics, in that the House of Councillors, the upper house of the Japanese Parliament, has a very substantial veto power over legislation coming to it from the lower house, and that can only be overturned by the lower house, the House of Representatives, with a 2/3 majority. Now, it's not quite clear to me whether the new government will have a clear 2/3 majority. I think it just about will. But I think it's going to be the case that in order to get its legislation through, the Abe government is going to have to make pacts with all sorts of minor groups in Japanese politics which are represented in the House of Councillors, the upper house.
Well, speaking of the upper house, the elections are due to take place next summer. So having said that, do you expect Abe to sort of tread a little more carefully and keep international provocation, if I can use that word, to a minimum, Professor?
Well, I mean, I'm sure he will try to do that, but political opinion in Japan today is extremely volatile, and between now and next July, when the next upper house elections take place, I think you may well find a shift of opinion against the LDP because it will be perceived as not being very much more effective than the Democratic Party, its predecessor.
Andrew, what is your take on Abe and how hawkish you expect him to be when it comes to the issue of China and the territorial dispute?
Well, I think that in order to maintain his grip on power, there is no doubt that Abe would like himself to be portrayed to be a much stronger kind of prime minister, and hence the territorial disputes. I don't think that Japan would give in to China and would like himself to be seen to stand up to China. Now, this is also complicated by the fact that America's pivot to Asia. Of course, America doesn't want to go to war with China. It's the kind of rebalancing of influence of geopolitics in the Asia Pacific. But that would give the a kind of military umbrella to a lot of China's neighbors, including particularly Japan. And so because of the American kind of military influence in the Asia Pacific, and because of the rise of Japanese nationalism, and because of the Japanese electorate dissatisfaction with how the things are going in the economy, and also how Japan is perceived and Japan's influence in the region and in the world, I think that's all leads to almost a more confrontational stand against China. And of course, China is herself cannot be seen to be weak. And there is a new leadership there in store. And of course, China's nationalism is also rising. And of course, the South China Sea, of course, is a very important conduit for the importation of oil and energy for China's economy. Apart from the fact that, of course, the South China Sea has a lot of reserves of resources. So all that leads to be a kind of a more confrontational stand between these countries, Japan, China, and possibly the United States. But then the conundrum is that none of these countries want to go to war. And so I think that the situation has got to be managed very, very carefully,
right,
because things can get out of hand unintentionally.
Right. Takuji, we heard Abe come out and say that, in fact, there is no room for negotiation when it comes to these disputed islands. What about the Japanese public? Is that a troubling sign for them?
Yes, indeed. In fact, I don't think Japanese populations are being particularly nationalistic at all. In fact, I think the support of the LDP actually started to fall a bit, primarily because Abe was seen as too nationalistic, and he was seen to be causing problems with China. For Japanese businesses and Japanese population, the utmost importance is the peaceful economic relationship with China. So we certainly do not want the hawkish government. And one thing I like to remind you is Mr. Abe is not necessarily that anti-China. Remember what he did in 2006. The first visit he did after becoming prime minister was he went to Beijing to settle the hostile relationship back then. So we could see actually surprises where Prime Minister Abe will actually successfully negotiate with China to settle the current dispute.
Professor, what do you make of these comments by Takuji? And also, if you can just give me your thoughts on some points that Andrew had raised, in fact, and relations with the United States. What line do you think the LDP is going to pursue when it comes to relations with the U.S., especially putting in context this Asia pivot that Washington is pursuing?
Well, I think that the relationship between Japan and China is pretty much on a knife edge at the moment, and it may be the case, though I think it will not necessarily be the case, that Mr. Abe will see the problems here and will try to calm things down with China. But my impression is that the Chinese government's in a pretty belligerent mood on these things. And one mustn't forget also that Japan has territorial disputes not only with China, but also with South Korea.
That's right.
Over the little islands called Dokdo in Korean, Takeshima in Japanese, and with the Russians up in the north, with the Northern Territories as they're called. And I think the question of sovereignty over small islands has become a huge issue for the whole region, as a matter of fact.
Let's move on to the economics, because Takuji, as you rightly pointed out just a few moments ago in a poll, in fact, in Japan, the biggest issue for voters was the economy and jobs. So is Abe the man to set Japan back on track economically?
Well, he could be. He certainly has some hopes. I do like his policy of trying to get Bank of Japan to do more. As an economist, I do feel that there's a lot Bank of Japan can do to reflate the economy, but for some reasons, I think Bank of Japan is being too traditional in monetary easing. Bank of Japan is saying they are doing too much. As they're too much, interest rate is already at zero. There's nothing they can do. But there is a lot they could do. So I actually do believe and
some
support
say, though, some
Abe's
say,
policy.
Takuji, that in fact these measures that Abe is proposing and might be going through are short-term fixes for the Japanese economy.
Yes, yes, I mean, the policy he's proposing is certainly not conventional. So there are a lot of certain risk involved in taking extraordinary monetary easing. But I do think this is an extraordinary time, and extraordinary time requires extraordinary measures.
Andrew, what do you make of the economic stagnation that Japan has been going through, and is Abe going to fare any better than his predecessor when it comes to the economy?
As I was saying, the Japanese people were very dissatisfied with how Japan has lost several decades. And then a lot of people are beginning to feel, especially the businesses, that a strong yen has been is possibly one of the part of the problem. And so you can see that in addition to interest rates, which are kept very low, almost zero, it's not going to solve the problem. The fact is that the Japanese yen is still extremely strong, and this it doesn't gel with the state of the Japanese economy. So I think that we are likely to see
where would he even start with the economy then, Andrew?
Exports.
Where would Abe even start then with the economy?
Well, the Japanese economy is not doing too well, and obviously the Japanese people are not very happy. And of course, the Japanese population is aging, and in fact, there is increasing poverty at the lower level. So this is a very serious both economic and social problems for Japan. And so the economy, of course, is very important, but it's the question of how to fix it. And of course, Japanese exports are still a great deal of strength. But what I'm trying to say is that apart from it's not just a question of interest rate, because the interest rate has been kept so low. It's the question of the strength of the Japanese yen. Now, don't forget, in the back several decades ago, the Japanese yen was quite weak, and because of the Plaza Accord, the Japanese yen was kept on a rising trend for several decades, and that wiped out and gradually eroded Japanese competitiveness. So I think that the strength of the yen is likely to be a hot button issue in the new administration. I think we're going to see a weaker yen in the years to come.
Are you hearing of any reforms that Abe is going to be taking that really represent looking at the long term, Andrew?
Well, I think that China is now become Japan's biggest trading partner. And so coming back to the relationship, there is no way that Japan would like to antagonize China too much, and least of all going to war. But on the other hand, because of the national politics, Japan has got to deal with that. But as far as the economy is concerned, the Japanese technology is also extremely strong. But the fact is that all the manufacturing processes that were used to be in Japan, creating a lot of jobs, have now been outsourced to China, and mostly to China, but also to a little bit to the rest of the region. And then, of course, a lot of the exports have embedded Japanese technology, Japanese components. So a weaker yen is likely to help Japan. And I think that the administration is putting a lot of pressure on the Bank of Japan and trying to do something about the yen. But don't forget that all these years under the current party, the Bank of China, the Bank of Japan has been a law to itself. But I think that this is likely to change with the new administration going to exert more influence over the Bank of Japan.
Let's just move on to another hot topic for just a moment, and that, of course, is the nuclear issue. We all remember the earthquake and tsunami in 2011 and the Fukushima nuclear disaster that happened as a result of that. Professor Stockwin, I wonder if you can answer this question, but how decisive do you think the nuclear issue was when it came to this election for the voters?
Well, the nuclear issue is certainly very salient in the politics that are to come of Japan. The Noda government, the government that has just been defeated, had a policy of essentially closing down nuclear power stations, although one or two were allowed to reopen. Apparently, Mr. Abe and the Liberal Democratic Party is much more pro-nuclear power and is likely to seek to reopen a number, at least, of these power stations. Now, there's one, for instance, on the other side of Japan from Tokyo, which has recently been discovered to lie precisely over an active seismic fault. And pretty plainly, that is not going to reopen. The Fukushima disaster in March 2011, has created in Japan an absolutely colossal feeling of opposition to nuclear power, something quintessentially dangerous. Of course, that causes, if you close all the nuclear power stations, that causes a big power deficit problem for Japan. They have to find energy sources from gas or whatever, which may be more polluting. But I think if Mr. Abe and the LDP decide to reopen nuclear power stations on a large scale, they're going to face a pretty big backlash from much of the population. And this is going to be a case of popular mobilization against the government, of which there have already been considerable signs in relation to the past government.
Takuji, I see you nodding along with Professor Stockwin.
Yes. Well, one thing I was actually a bit surprised with the election, with the result of election, is that the party which was most actually against the nuclear power didn't do too well. So that surprised me, because I did think that Japanese population do care a lot about nuclear power issue. But what the election result is saying is it doesn't. It was actually the case that the Japanese population thought the nuclear issue was a minor point. So employment, growth, these were the most important issue in the Japanese population's mind.
Right, but how successful, just going to the point that was raised by the professor in Oxford, how successful can Abe be in renegotiating the restart of these nuclear power plants when the Japanese public are anti-nuclear?
Right. I think, well, judging from the election result, Japanese population don't care that much about nuclear power. Of course, these local population do care about what they are doing with the local nuclear power station. But on the national level, I think there's actually a consensus that it is inevitable that some nuclear power, Japan have to be dependent on nuclear power for some time.
Professor Stockwin, this is the third prime minister in 3 years in Japan. Why is this position so notoriously difficult to hold on to?
Well, I don't think it's one single reason. I think each case is different. After the 5.5-year prime ministership of Mr. Koizumi, which ended in 2006, you had annual prime ministerships for 3 years, Mr. Abe, Mr. Fukuda, Mr. Aso. And then in 2009, the LDP was very substantially defeated. The Democratic Party came to power. And its first prime minister, Mr. Hatoyama, got into terrible difficulties over the renegotiation of a particular base, American Marine base in Okinawa. And that essentially led to his demise as prime minister. And he was succeeded by Mr. Kan, who had to deal with the aftermath of the Fukushima and disaster and the tsunami and the earthquake. And I think that his case is very instructive. In many ways, he was a good prime minister. But a situation has developed between the parties in Japan, and this comes back to the issue of the upper house veto, in which the opposition party, whoever it may be, in that case it was the Liberal Democratic Party, in a completely unprincipled way simply seek to destroy the government of the day. And this happened in a time of national emergency following the the disasters in the north of Japan in 2011.
Right.
This is not just the fault of the LDP, although I think they behave pretty disgracefully, but it is inbuilt into the particular structure of politics that exists at the present time in Japan, which in many ways is dysfunctional.
All right. Well, on that note, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you very much to all my guests in Tokyo, Okubo Takuji, in Hong Kong, Andrew Leung, and in Oxford, Professor Arthur Stockwin. And thanks very much for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. You can always send us your feedback and your comments. Email your thoughts to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Thanks for watching. And from me and the whole team, goodbye for now.